Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest edition of the Fireside with Founders and Leaders podcast. Today, I am delighted to be joined by Victor Kula-Szilagyi, who is head of product at a company called SEDNA. So, SEDNA create enterprise-level software for the shipping industry. Victor himself has moved into a product role from a design role, which is where he started out many moons ago. He's moved from the consumer world into the B2B enterprise software level world. So we talk about some of the changes, some of the challenges that he's come up against, and some of the ways of working that have really helped him over his time in his career. We also have the opportunity to talk a bit about what SEDNA have been doing and how they're changing some of the landscape in an industry that is hundreds, if not thousands of years old. I hope you really enjoy, so check it out. Hello, Victor, and welcome to the podcast.
Hi there, how are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Very good indeed. After all the rigmarole of getting into, are you on mute? Are you not on mute? We're here.
I think it's a requirement of any conversation these days. I can't wait till that actually translates into face-to-face conversation.
Yeah, I know. I've started doing more and more sort of face-to-face podcasts and also face-to-face meets with customers, and it's a delight to actually see people in person, to be honest.
Sure.
So look, I've given a brief overview of to sort of who you are, sort of, and a bit more about sort of say all the things that sort of we discuss overall. But if we could just sort of start by talking a bit more about sort of your background, obviously coming from design through to where you are now in product, and then we'll take it through from there, if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi everybody. My name is Victor Kula-Szilagyi. I'm head of product at SEDNA. As Rupert mentioned, my background is in design. I come to product in a bit of a roundabout way. My interest has always been between things, between technology and society, between people and cities and environments. So, there was no real concept of digital product when I was in university. It was right around the start of the dot-com boom. I ended up actually studying psychology and urban planning. So how the squidgy gray stuff in our heads actually affect the hard, solid gray stuff in our cities. Like, what's the relationship between people and place? And at the same time, working at startups in New York around that time. So beginning to learn about digital and this multiple media stuff and how all that stuff comes together. And for me, it's always been about the synthesis of those things. So I ended up falling into an interesting place where I was working with a bunch of architects who'd given up on architecture to build digital experiences for museums.
Yeah.
And really beginning to see the interesting synthesis between the things that I was studying in psychology and urban planning and the digital environments we were creating. How do you create something that is welcoming, that brings someone along a journey, that makes them feel included in something and allows them to learn something new? And that really opened up some really interesting opportunities to think about how technology enhances people's lives, how people work together. And one of the interesting things that also came out there was a realization that, no matter how great an idea you have, if you can't find a way to make money off of it, ultimately you can't keep having fun doing it.
Yeah.
And so that's always been a part of the cycle of the lessons in my life. Has always been like, okay, how do we make something that's really valuable, but I can also make somehow sustainable? So in that time there, I learned a great deal about creating great experiences. I ended up moving to Italy to go to grad school at a really interesting little experimental school that was very much looking at technology as craft, almost like design and craft. And how you start bringing those things together brought me to London, where I ended up working for some really interesting strategic design firms. So pre-iPhone, thinking about what is the future of a mobile operating system? How does that actually make that? How do you make that work?
Yeah.
Doing some fascinating work with some telecoms companies who were basically saying, well, if Google can make an operating system, why can't we? And learning about how different organizations ultimately can't necessarily do exactly the same things. So they're not set up in the right way. So I was constantly coming up against this challenge where we were trying to do great, amazing things at a user experience and a design level, but if it didn't actually carry all the way through to understanding the politics of the organization, the way the organization itself works, what its business model was, we could have great ideas, but we couldn't necessarily execute them. And then on the flip side, working in places like Samsung and Intel afterwards, having the reverse problem where there were interesting ideas that were coming, or ambitions coming out of business teams about how or why we should be making money in a particular way that weren't necessarily taking into account the realities of how a human being
Yeah.
deals with their technology,
Which is so important, right?
which is critical. So it's never about one or the other. It's about the synthesis of those things for me. And that's how I really kind of blend concepts that I learned in design and in psychology about being user-centered or human-centered, really thinking about what is the context in which someone's working in, what is the context of the organization that someone is working in to make the thing that they're trying to make, and really bringing those things together, because one without the other is never particularly satisfying and doesn't necessarily get you the greatest bit of success. So for me, it's always about talking about like how the best products oftentimes are also really good political artifacts. Like if the organization can't see itself in the thing that it's making, it doesn't become a successful thing. So, I joke sometimes about in my time at Samsung where, I can look at the back of a television and I can tell you which two departments weren't speaking to each other.
Yeah.
Literally things don't fit.
Yeah.
And that's where, design and engineering is as much about the social relationships and the politics involved as it is about trying to solve the problem for the customer. And that's really where I think product management becomes a really interesting thing.
Yeah, nice. And so that leads quite nicely on to your journey through from, as you say, from design now into a head of product role and into product management. And it's not like super common as we see for most people in the product world. They come from some sort of business background as opposed to design, although there are people out there like you who have moved from design into product. And I think certainly some of the things you were just mentioning there about sort of making sure you've got that sort of human-centered focus around when you're sort of building the product, and that sort of coherence between sort of engineering, design, product, everyone, to make sure that the customer and the human is ultimately at the front and center of it. Makes sense that people coming from that design background would fit really nicely into a product role. So tell me a bit more about sort of your transition into that role in product, and why you decided to go from a design role to a product-led role.
I think it was an interesting challenge, and it is a bit of a steep one. I think it does also speaks to how the role of design has changed over the last 20 years and how even people are beginning to educate designers, less so at the undergraduate level, more so at the graduate level, to actually think more about the larger business implications of what they're doing. I think for me, it was very much about, because I'm interested in the spaces between things, like filling the gaps between those things, it naturally just kind of evolved for me, because I would get to a place where we would have a brief come in or a requirement come in from a business standpoint where I really had to interrogate why was this decision being made, and had to prove whether or not that, before going ahead and spending millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, like what are we actually doing to prove that this actually makes sense?
Yeah.
And that's what I really ended up finding really valuable in my career. I was very lucky to work in a couple of places where we were in design teams, but in very strategic conversations about new products and services. And it was our job to not only make sure that the thing looked really cool and worked really well, but we really understood the consumer and what was happening there. And what I found was the only way to be successful is to keep moving up that chain and to talk to our stakeholders in the organization about, does this actually make business sense?
Yeah.
And how are we going to do it? And I found that really rewarding and interesting in my time in two places. So at Samsung, I was part of a team that was very much this is also really interesting, because I think one of the things that's interesting about the relationship between design and product management is, in design, especially when you're first coming out, you're thinking about making something that's going to work right now for the customer that you've just figured out how to deal with today.
Yeah.
The reality is, in large organizations with especially in hardware, you have a long lead time of years.
Yeah.
So the question is, are you solving, and this is actually a funny one that actually comes back to my study of urban planning. There's a great book by an author named Peter Hall, and he talks about how the problem with urban planning is that you're always fighting yesterday's battles, because by the time you've come up with a policy and figured out what you're going to do and implemented it, the impact might be 10 years later.
Yeah.
So are you solving the problem? The problem that you're solving for might not be the problem 10 years from now.
Which is the same
And
with technology, right? In terms of, because it's
exactly,
evolving
yeah.
so
So when
quickly.
you're talking about when I had moved out of just doing stuff for the web and started working in hardware companies like Samsung and Intel, all of a sudden it wasn't a question of like looking at what a consumer is doing today, but hold on, it's going to take us 2 to 3 years to get a device out. It takes about 18 to 24 months to make a mobile phone.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting there is you have to start thinking about time horizons. Like, what are we doing now? But what does that actually lead to the next part? So you naturally stop thinking about the immediate thing, but you have to think about the roadmap. What's your big, hairy, audacious goal like 3 years from now? And how do you work back to like, what's the first thing you're going to make?
Yeah.
And that became like a really interesting challenge in my mind. And then that starts opening up all sorts of fun questions because then you start going, okay, well, I have this really great idea. I think it's going to make a lot of money. But wait a minute, how much is it going to take to actually get the tooling in place, get all this stuff to do, and is actually more valuable to do something else? And that becomes like a really interesting and frustrating conversation for a designer because you kind of go, but I'm making this amazing thing. It's like, yeah, but like I had to learn that the hard way. At Intel, we worked on some really interesting projects where, the projections were we could probably make tens, if not a few $100 million. But for a company like Intel, if it doesn't make $1 billion, they're not interested. It's like, well, I can take the same 20 people and maybe do something else. And you go, oh, okay. How do
Yeah.
I start thinking about that scale and really thinking about the impact of those things? And that's what really became interesting because then you start really learning about from a product management perspective, how the important thing is actually learning when and how to say no.
Yeah.
Like, and I think some of my more successful experiences in my career, while I've also had really successful experience shipping things, has actually been really happy and satisfied to kill something that I don't think a company should be doing.
Yeah.
We did an amazing project years ago where we were asked to basically create some products um, for the developing market. We had some really interesting engaged customers in those markets buying it, but in the end, when you looked at the amount of service design and service experience you'd have to put around this piece of hardware to actually make it viable, the costs no longer made any sense. And if you just deliver the product as is, the customer would never be happy. They'd just be wasting their money.
Yeah.
And so it becomes not just a question of like, yeah, we can still make money, but where's the ethics in that? It's like, you really want to make something that someone's going to spend maybe a third of their salary for a year to buy, and then it's just going to become a doorstop. Does that even make any sense at all?
Yeah.
And that's where I started finding like really interesting challenges to kind of like break apart and do more and more reading like business books like Built to Last, and while I'm still very much involved in looking at like thoughts around design, it's like it's really you can't have one without the other, and that's how I kind of brought those things together.
Nice. And you've obviously worked in sort of different areas, so working on products that are more consumer focused to now moving into with SEDNA a more sort of B2B enterprise software product specifically for the sort of marine shipping industry. So different levels of complexity, right, in terms of the things that you're dealing with, and there are different ways of doing things comparatively to the consumer facing stuff, comparatively to the business facing stuff. So what are the things that you've seen there in terms of the differences and the challenges that you've had to overcome sort of making that transition as well?
The interesting thing is something that my career took a shift about 4 years ago, looking more and more into more complex, I wouldn't say more complex spaces, but more mission driven, more mission critical spaces where, where I had been much more focused on consumer experiences that are great. People are, they're not only be pleasurable and desirable and you want to spend time with them, but when they are critical to, moving money, investment, getting physical goods from one place to another, the stakes are actually much higher, right?
Yeah.
Like you have to make sure that you make things in a way that works a particular way. And this was particularly interesting before I even got here. I ended up spending a fair amount of time working in like trading tools in finance. And all of a sudden the requirements of what is usable or valuable or desirable are very different from what a consumer needs.
Yeah.
And you spend a lot of time really looking at the nuances of how people work that become quite an interesting thing. And then you have to layer on top again that question of time, because it's not just about like an individual consumer's adoption of something because they think it's interesting. It's how do you shift an entire organization or an industry to start working in a particular way if they've only worked another way before.
Yeah.
So the challenges there are very much about, a variety of things. Not only is it valuable to the company that they're doing it, but is it viable that you can actually build it in a way that actually they're going to be able to use it?
Yeah.
Is it feasible to even build it in a way that you can make any money off of it? And ultimately, is someone going to be, happy to use it? And that's
Yes.
where those challenges come into play. So what's interesting about my experience in finance, and now in shipping, is that a lot of the behaviors are very similar. They're very much interdisciplinary environments with a high volume of data, that are highly interdependent, and people have to make decisions quickly. And what happens there is you have to really understand the work patterns that have been ingrained, that to the point where they become muscle memory.
Mhm.
So, when you look at a trading desk and you have a trader who's like 6 screens with all the information there, and he's trying, he's working, he or she are working with, both hands and their phone and everything
Yeah.
else. It's because they have this high volume of information that they have to act on immediately. And one of the interesting challenges there is also that the way in which technology works, they don't necessarily always trust the information in front of them. So they need to see every single type of information at once,
Yeah.
and then make a judgment call on how those things work. And that's kind of also what's happening in the shipping industry. You have a highly interdependent group of people across oftentimes multiple companies trying to make a decision quickly to get an object across the ocean from one place to another.
Yeah.
And you have to tease that apart in some really interesting ways, because you go, well, why can't we just make this much simpler? It's like, well, when you open Pandora's box, there's like 50 levels of reasons why, whether it's compliance or the way people have worked for years or different country regulation, any number of things that
Yeah.
that make it a really interesting space. Now, that said, the fascinating thing about that is that these spaces move much more slowly, and you can actually take a lot of lessons learned from your consumer experience. So lots of things that are like known solved problems in consumer environments about how to make things more approachable, or alert people in a particular way, or just make it something that you can live on a mobile device. You can make small changes in an enterprise environment that have quite big impact, because people have been used to a frustrating way of working for so long,
Yeah.
that the smallest slices that you can make can actually make
Suddenly gives
huge
them
impact.
hours back of their life and day. And
Yeah, and that's exactly what we talk about at SEDNA. It's actually about like, how do we save like hours or days of people's time just doing the work that they are doing. So for us, it's very much about, we talk about this concept of effortless operations, and it's very much about the space that I come from. It's between things. When we have someone working in a shipping context, they have the most prevalent communications platform that everybody uses, which is email.
yeah.
And then they have lots of systems on the other side that help them with, ERP tasks. Where's this vessel? Where's it going? Where's the cargo? Fuel costs. And then you have things like, invoicing systems and billing and everything else. Now, the reality is that when you, in a shipping context, which is quite interesting, to de-risk any voyage, you have multiple parties in play. The company that owns the ship isn't necessarily the company that's actually managing the cargo, isn't necessarily
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
company that has the crew. And in each one of those organizations, you then have legal and finance departments, and agency teams that are actually buying and selling time on ships.
Yeah.
And so that creates a really messy space where, we talk quite a lot about the idea that you have, where they've been working in email for like the last 20 years. So everything becomes a CC'd email. So I'm emailing you and John and Tim and Sally across 3 different departments, and they're all CCing other people. So all of a sudden, instead of having one conversation, you might have this ripple effect of thousands of emails that basically say the same thing.
Yeah.
And then you have to dig through all of that and then look into your other systems and try to figure out what actually happened in a relationship. And what we try to do is marry that all together. So instead, you have one single conversation. You don't go to each individual person. You go to a shared environment. So I email operations at shipping company A. SEDNA reads the email and goes, aha, this email is about this particular voyage. We're
Yeah.
going to connect it to all the right systems. And what you end up having is a really great conversational layer over your hard data
Yeah.
that gives you almost like, in one way, I like to talk about it as like the director's commentary on the DVD. You can actually see the conversation around the decision-making pattern,
Yeah.
and everybody has much more clarity and can work much more efficiently, because you're no longer trying to dig through thousands of messages. You have a very clear line of what's actually happening,
Yeah.
and everybody has much more visibility.
Which is perfect. It's like a single source of truth, ultimately, of like, this is
Yeah, exactly.
what's been happening.
And this, the thing for me, which is interesting about this, is also in my previous jobs, having seen how other supply chains work, like this has actually massive opportunity across lots of other industries. You can imagine it in legal or in government or in, finance, where you have teams of tens, if not hundreds of people working together, but not necessarily always in the most coordinated fashion.
Yeah.
And really what we're trying to do is kind of connect the data in your systems to the decision making you're doing in more unstructured spaces and give you a better understanding of what you're doing. And that's where it's been particularly fascinating, because it's like, especially now when we, with post-COVID and everything else, I think people start thinking, are more aware of what a supply chain is.
Yeah.
And to actually be working on something that is like so vital to the way in which we live today is actually really fascinating and enormously interesting thing for me.
Yeah, there's so much complexity in all of that, and like you say, so many different moving components that you can, I suppose, you make one sort of potential error of not considering one sort of party in all of that sort of supply chain. It can have catastrophic effects, right, in terms of the overall sort of productivity of the supply chain, and making sure that, like as you say, in the simplest form, the goods get from A to B. But there's loads of different things that make up.
But there's about like potentially 300 steps between A and B that we all take for granted. And I think the interesting thing is how we begin to visualize the connections between those things. And so, in my past job around finance, it was very much about making decisions around data and visualizing data. And here it's very much about like how the conversation around the data drives a decision that impacts multiple organizations at the same time. And that's a really interesting
nice thing. And you've worked in probably two of the sort of oldest industries in the world, being sort of finance and shipping. And you talked there about transformational change and things sort of moving fairly slowly. Now I think finance and fintech has over the last 5-10 years have started to move pretty quickly with a lot of their transformational change. But from the things that I've seen, certainly with some of the customers that we have in the shipping industry, it is a slower burn. But things are now starting to speed up, and there is a lot more change going on in the sector.
I think the interesting way to think about it is, I think there's, in any industry, there's always fast-paced change in different parts of the industry. The thing that changes the way people work is the forces around them to actually make that happen. But I think the other thing that's important when we think about, even in fintech, like I think fintech has really opened up quite a lot at the retail end because regulations have changed, and there are things that are happening in the more enterprise environment as well. But they move slower because you have bigger potential impacts on whole ecosystems. So it's not so easy to go overnight, everybody's going to change the way they work. I think, especially when you have environments where there's high volumes, a lot of things to do in a highly complex way, people also, out of necessity, become driven by muscle memory. I do this in this way because it's the most efficient way. It's the way that I know it. If I deviate from that, it's going to be a problem, right? And it's the same in medicine or insurance or in anything else. Like, you can't just say, well, this is silly, I'm just going to scrap everything because you guys have been doing it wrong for 1,000 years. So no, they've been doing it for 1,000 years a particular way because that's the way it works.
Yeah.
And so it's very much about finding the right slices of change that make sense for the organizations themselves.
Yeah.
And seeing how can you make the technology kind of work in their context. And that's a lot of what we do. I think you also have to be very cognizant of the environment you're in. So we are very fortunate in that, the founder of this company and a lot of the people here have been working in the shipping industry for a very long time.
Yeah.
And they understand the challenges in there. But when I speak to our founder, like this is one of the things that he first said to me when he was explaining to me how certain parts of the industry works. Like, you have to remember that, like, port agency has been around for like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Like, people have been managing ports and ships coming in and out of ports for a very, very long time. And that's not a bad thing. But then to think about how they work in new contexts, the challenge there becomes, okay, it's true. If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah.
But there are lots of things that can be fixed and be optimized, especially when we have things that need to move faster and you need more certainty and there's more and more risk around the things that you're doing. What we have to do is be really clear about how we can optimize the things that are most vitally important to them. And I think one of the things that there, when we talk about products and developing new products and services, this is not a space like in fintech where you can move fast and break things.
Yeah.
You move fast and you break things, there's gonna be problems. You have to move
really
fast.
Breaks, yeah. Ships sink,
right? Ships sink. Well, people lose money.
Yeah.
Cargo goes bad. Like we deal, in things that can rot.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
For example. And that's where it becomes much more interesting to think about, rather than minimal viable products, minimal saleable products.
Mm-hmm.
Like what's the thing that is actually going to help someone achieve a goal that I know that they will have enough confidence in to buy.
Yeah.
And then I can prove to them that it will be valuable to them and allow them to grow what they're doing. So you can't necessarily just go off and just make like quick changes to things. You can do that in small pockets, and the way you do that is you find, like in any other sort of MVP process, you find friendly customers who are willing to go with you on a journey to get to a place.
Yeah.
But after a point, like you have to be much more cognizant of the things that they're doing in their work to make sure that what you're achieving actually achieves the goal that they want to achieve.
I was going to say, so is that sort of how you go about doing it, making those sort of changes? Because where you're saying is, as you just said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And there are lots of people who've been doing it in the same way for many, many years, and it works. So how do you, I suppose, show people the benefits of making these changes and
you go after the parts of the thing that are clearly broken?
Yeah,
frankly. So like the interesting space where SEDNA came into place is going back to the original challenge. Let's go back to what happened with email. Email was built as this idea of a digital letter, point to point, one person to one person. It was never really defined for the idea of having, hundreds or thousands of people constantly interacting with it in the same way. Yes, you can do mass mails, but when you get chains of people, 10, 20, 30 people emailing themselves on the same thread over and over again, sometimes for years, you end up with a really messy data space that causes two problems. One, it becomes very hard to search.
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges there is specifically in places like maritime, where you actually have to understand not only that a vessel got from A to B, but what happened over it, and even maybe look back at it like 3 to 5 months later. That volume of data becomes very hard to actually search through and find like the most important thing. And that's actually where a lot of our customers were coming at a first pass when SEDNA was founded, we're coming into a problem. It's like the volume of information and the way in which it was being stored made it very difficult for people to be efficient. And what SEDNA does is it flips the model of the way in which we deal with email, in that it's no longer thousands of copies of a thing. It's a single thing in a single place that we wrap data around. So all of a sudden, the people are doing the same tasks, right? They're working to get a vessel from point A to B, but they don't have to struggle with the technology as it existed to get to the decisions that they need to make. And that's really where we come into play. Like, we're not trying to, like, the way shipping works today, it works over email. We're not trying to stop using email. We're saying we're going to make this a better thing for you based on the way in which you work.
Yeah.
That's really where we kind of come into play. It's very much going, how do we go, okay, you are having all these complex conversations and you have all these other systems. How do we marry them in the best possible way to make you more efficient? And not say, you know what, forget everything you know. We're going to give you something completely new.
Yeah.
We're doing quite a lot of novel things in the interface that actually do require teams to wrap their heads around a different way of working, like working as a team. Well, they're already working as a team, but creating a team-based interface around something that was traditionally a one-to-one thing does require you to think about the experience in a different way as well. But it's a wholly separate problem from saying, you know what, we're going to forget 30 years of the way you're working. We're going to create a whole new thing, and we're going to ask all the companies in the world to try a completely new way of working. And it's like we're trying to fix the things where you're working, and not try to say, forget all of that. That's not going to work for you anymore. It's very much about how do we improve what you're already doing.
Yeah, which is what it's all about ultimately, is making those sort of incremental changes, as you said, to make their lives easier to do their jobs and give them back more time. So what's sort of next for SEDNA? Well, what's on the roadmap? What exciting things are you guys doing at the moment?
Oh, I won't speak too much to the roadmap. I think the challenges that we're working towards are really that. I think the interesting thing is we are at a place where we are continually widening the opportunity of what you can do when you start changing the way in which you work and communicate. And for us, that's very much about driving the way in which we think about um, the connection between how you communicate and how you store the information that you have. So we have in the last few months released what we're calling a connected apps environment that actually has lots of really interesting integrations. So for example, emails that come in now with like invoice information, we can automatically extract the information and put it into your system of record. We're making it much more possible to do automated actions on top of those messages that will make you more and more efficient. And for us, it's really about how do we open that up and make that easier and easier to
Yeah.
do. And really, that's where we're focusing, is improving the core experience of how people do their daily work, but then also expanding the capabilities of how you can, basically make email programmable.
Yeah.
How do you take the data out of email and make it something that you can do something with in a way that you can do with structured data, but typically, like, this is a really interesting thing about the shipping industry and other industries is actually a lot of the emails are basically already semi-structured information.
Yeah.
But how you take that out and allow you to act on it so you can read the information, but in the background there's lots of other things that are already happening for you, is really where we're focused.
Nice.
And that's, yeah, so we've got a few things in that respect that we actually had a recent release about 2-3 weeks ago now, where we really started talking about the concept of workflow automations. So how we can start helping our partners and our customers extract data out of those messages,
Yeah.
and do other things with them. And that's really a core focus of where we're going in this.
So get more than just sort of have the data. It's using the data for something that they can sort of benefit their sort of business and operations with.
Yeah, exactly. Like, do you have to spend all your time digging through these emails and then cutting and pasting and putting it into your data, into your systems of record, or do we just pull it out for you?
Yeah.
And you go, okay, don't worry about it. Like, if we can get to a place where you're reading less email and still making the same decisions, is kind of where we're going. And so we want to be surfacing the most important salient information for you and allow you to kind of get on with your day.
Yeah.
And that's really what we're focused on.
Nice. So as a parting word of wisdom, I'm going to sort of take it back to the sort of the piece where we were talking about your transition from design into product. So if there's anyone out there sort of listening to this and they're in a design role at the moment and they're thinking about, actually, I'd quite like to get into more of a product driven role, what advice would you give to those people about where they can set themselves up to sort of position themselves to get into a more product driven role?
There's a couple of different things that you can do, and I think they are things that you more and more in design people are learning about, but it's very much about the concept of how do you validate that the idea that you have actually is effective, and how do you prove it to people in an organization. And one important way of doing that is making sure that you are really hyper aware of proving that things work within a particular trend. Like, can you look at a market and say, okay, based on the market trends, we think that we have an idea here, but then we've actually validated it by prototyping it and giving it to users and saying, look, there is value here. Being open to thinking a little bit about things like beyond just usability testing, thinking about things like price testing, right? Like, how much is someone willing to pay for something? How do you model things in a particular way? And a lot of the interesting things that come out of like interaction design, thinking about user experience, the prototyping models there actually work beyond just usability testing. You can prototype a service, you can prototype a business, setting yourself that goal of going, okay, I have a thing that I'm going to make and I believe I can make X amount of money. What can I do in 2 to 3 weeks to prove some viability of that thing? And getting that into your mindset actually really helps quite a lot when you're speaking to internal business stakeholders about something. Because if you can convince them that the idea is not only a good one because you think human beings like it, but you can actually prove to them that there's some money to be made there. That's how you begin to move the conversation. But it's also about bringing those people who aren't used to actually testing things with humans along with that process as well. So that's a classic thing from anybody who's worked in user research, is trying to bring people who live in the more business context out into the world and figure out how they validate things with customers.
Nice.
And that's really where I think there's like a lot of space to do that. I think the next space in there is to also help people understand, and this is also like a classic thing from consulting. I had a colleague of mine who was very good when we were running a design agency, dealing with customers who wanted everything all at once. Like, you can have everything, it's just a question of what order you want it in.
Yeah.
Right. How do you help as a designer? Because a designer will get hundreds of requirements. Everything needs to be solved at once. Well, the reality is nothing ever gets solved all at once.
Yeah.
But to the extent that you can communicate back to your organization going, okay, but like, what's the actual sequence or importance of these things?
Yeah.
You naturally kind of begin to fall into not only doing it for your own work and from a design perspective, but you become more effective in an organization.
Yeah.
And you become the person that people go, hey, that guy or gal actually has a lot of good thinking about the way we should sequence things. How do we get him or her into the conversation earlier?
Yeah.
That's a lot of design thinking conversations and within design circles in the last 20 years is about how does design get to the table earlier?
Yeah.
Question then is like, what do you do once you're at the table? Are you at the table to just advocate for the user because you only still want to work on the user experience from a design perspective, or do you want to move into that larger conversation? And both places are happy places to live, right? It's just a question of how you want to do it. And I think for me, I ended up finding my happy place, while I still love and care about design, in being further upstream at the fuzzy front end where you kind of go, okay, there's a world of possibility, but what's actually viable? What are we really going to make an impact with is where I found my happy place. While other people, and as find it much more at the craft end of the experience. It just really depends on where you
want to sit. And it's a lot of it is about understanding, as you say, that what's the problem you're trying to solve, and what's also the business impact of the problem you're trying to solve.
Exactly. I think that's really always an important thing. Like, I think it's one of the things also, like going back to my time in design school, is like when you go into a design program, there are design programs that are in schools that are, for the arts as well. And there's always a divide, like, am I an artist or am I a designer? No, a designer is there to make things that work.
Yeah.
Like, yes, it should have creative expression and should have an emotional resonance, but if it doesn't actually solve a problem, it's not something that I'm as interested in.
Yeah.
And so the question then becomes, when you look at it from a product management perspective, especially now with software or anything else, then it becomes a question of like, well, how do you design something that actually scales, that actually has longevity? I think one of the great books that I read about this when I was starting getting more interested is Built to Last. Do you want to build an organization that tells the time, or just builds a single clock?
Yeah.
Like, things that are built around a single founder don't have this longevity. Like, what's the impact that you want to be making? And for me, I think that's a really interesting thing to think about. Like, how do you make things with longevity? And that's what got me more into the sort of product management space.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you over the course of this. I really appreciate you giving up your time to talk and share and impart some of your wisdom that I'm sure, no doubt, will help a fair few people along their way in terms of making a similar journey. So look, thanks again for coming on, and I'll hopefully speak to you soon.
Thank you.